I don't date black women, the cold millionaire said, until she walked in with heels and stole his heart. Welcome back to Beyond Color Stories, family. I'm James, and today I want to begin with a little prayer straight from the heart. May love find you in the quietest corners of your life. May healing meet every wound, and may joy sit with you longer than sorrow ever could. Where are you listening to me from today? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing our family growing across the world. And listen, I've got a special request. Please don't skip this story. This one is extra close to my heart because it was written by my beautiful wife, Selena. She poured all her love into crafting what I believe is one of the most romantic and soul-touching stories we've ever shared here. So here's what I need from you. When the story ends, give it your rating out of 10 in the comments. I can't wait to see your thoughts. Now, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story full of love, passion, and transformation. All right, let's dive into today's masterpiece. The Grand Ballroom of the Saint. Regis Hotel glittered like a jewel in the heart of Manhattan, its vaulted ceilings painted with murals of angels and constellations, its chandeliers dripping golden light across polished marble floors where the wealthiest of New York society mingled. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided between clusters of men in sharp tuxedos and women in gowns stitched with silver threads, carrying trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like diamonds. Conversations overlapped in an elegant hum, filled with words about acquisitions, investments, and whispered scandals that could ruin reputations overnight. At the very center of this storm of wealth and ego stood Brethwood Cole, the man everyone's eyes were drawn to whether they loved him or despised him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, his hair slicked back in a style that spoke of both money and meticulous care, and his piercing blue eyes radiated the same chill as the December night beyond the ballroom windows. Dressed in a tuxedo so perfectly tailored it looked poured onto him, Brethwood exuded the arrogance of a man who had conquered every boardroom he stepped into. And tonight he held court among his friends as though the entire world belonged to him. With a casual smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, he swirled the amber liquid in his glass of aged scotch and delivered a statement so cold, so cutting, that it sliced through the chatter around him like a sharpened blade. "I don't date black women," he said, his voice calm but final, dripping with the kind of dismissive certainty that only a man untouchable by consequences could wield. For a moment there was silence, and then laughter rippled from the group of wealthy men surrounding him, each one eager to echo his arrogance, their chuckles shallow and hollow, their smirks designed to mirror his. Some of the women nearby glanced over, eyes narrowing, lips tightening, but no one dared confront him. Not here, not tonight, not when his influence stretched so far into their world. Brethwood leaned back slightly, satisfied, lifting his glass in a mock salute to his friends, as though the cruelty of his words were merely another badge of his superiority. But fate has a taste for irony. Just as the echo of laughter faded beneath the chandeliers, the massive double doors at the end of the ballroom swung open, and for the first time that night, the room seemed to pause. Selena Harris entered with a presence that demanded silence, her every step deliberate, graceful, and commanding in a way no arrogance could ever replicate. Her smooth brown skin glowed under the cascading light, radiant as if the chandeliers themselves bowed to her arrival. Her braided hair fell in long, intricate waves, a crown upon her head, framing her high cheekbones and full lips painted a deep, mesmerizing red. She wore an emerald green gown that hugged her body in the right places, yet flowed behind her like liquid silk. And when her eyes swept the room, those sharp, dark eyes that seemed to see everything, they carried a depth that pulled at the air itself, daring anyone to underestimate her. Conversation stuttered and stalled. Even the violins seemed to soften as though acknowledging her presence. Brethwood, who had never been rattled by anything or anyone, felt the first crack in the icy armor he had built over years of pride and wealth. His smirk faltered, his breath caught, and though he forced himself to glance away as if uninterested, he could not stop the tightening in his chest, the strange ache that told him something in this moment was shifting against his will. He told himself it was nothing, a fleeting reaction to a beautiful woman walking into a room. But the lie tasted bitter on his tongue, for he had never once faltered at beauty before. His pride insisted he remain still, remain detached, remain untouchable. But deep within, something clawed at him, whispering that this woman, this Selina Harris, was not someone he could so easily dismiss. Across the room, Selina was unaware of the remark that had been made just before she entered, but she noticed the eyes that followed her, the whispers that trailed her name. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her chin lifted slightly, her shoulders squared, her stride poised yet soft. She was here for business, for connections, for the networks that power demanded. But even if she hadn't been, she would still have owned that room by simply existing within it. Her gaze skimmed across the crowd, catching for the briefest moment the man whose blue eyes burned against her skin. Brethwood looked away too quickly, and yet his body betrayed him. His jaw tensed, his fingers tightened against the crystal glass he held, and a flicker of something raw, something unguarded, passed through his expression before arrogance quickly reclaimed its throne. Brethwood told himself it was coincidence. Just another woman. Just another face in a sea of admirers he would forget by morning. But his mind betrayed him, already replaying the tilt of her head, the way the gown hugged her form, the shimmer of her skin under the chandelier's glow. He sipped his drink too quickly, the burn of the liquor grounding him in the lie he desperately clung to, that she was nothing, that she meant nothing. And yet the truth carved itself into his chest with each passing second. He could not stop watching her. Mini cliffhanger beats began to form in his restless thoughts. Why had his words cracked in the exact moment she walked through those doors? Why did the statement he had just spoken feel suddenly hollow, suddenly false? He felt the invisible rope tightening between them, and he hated it, despised it, because Brethwood Cole did not stumble, did not falter, did not want what he swore he could not have. And yet here he was, standing in the golden light of Manhattan's most opulent ballroom, pretending to laugh with friends, while every nerve in his body strained toward the woman who had unknowingly shattered his arrogant declaration in a single entrance. As Selina crossed the room, speaking to familiar faces and shaking hands with confidence, Brethwood's heart beat harder than it should have, and his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Who was she, really? Why did his chest tighten every time her laughter, rich and melodic, floated in his direction? Why, when he had everything a man could want, wealth, power, influence, did it feel as though one glance from her eyes had stripped it all away and left him standing there, exposed, bare and uncertain? He straightened his shoulders, forcing his smirk back into place, convincing himself that tomorrow he would forget her, that this was a fluke, a momentary slip. But deep inside, beneath the armor of arrogance he wore so well, Brethwood Cole already knew the truth he would never admit aloud. Not yet. Not tonight. Selina Harris was the beginning of something that would destroy the cold walls he had built around himself. And though he told himself he didn't care, the echo of her entrance haunted him long after the gala lights blurred into gold, and the night stretched endlessly before him. And somewhere deep in the restless chambers of his heart, an undeniable truth whispered in defiance of his arrogant words. This was not the end of anything. It was the dangerous beginning. As Brethwood lifted his glass once more, trying to drown the strange fire burning inside him, his eyes locked with Selina's across the ballroom for a fleeting second. Her gaze was unshaken, piercing straight through his defenses, as if she had already seen the man behind the mask. He blinked, and she was already speaking to someone else, smiling as if she hadn't just unraveled him. Brethwood's pulse thundered in his ears, his pride demanding he forget her. But his heart had already betrayed him. And as the gala swirled on, one dangerous question consumed him. Why did he suddenly feel like he couldn't breathe? The gala carried on with its music and murmured conversations, but for Brethwood the night had already shifted. The echo of Selina's confident entrance had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain, and no matter how many glasses of scotch he tried to hide behind, he found his eyes drifting back toward her. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, exchanging smiles, her laughter like a melody that cut through the chatter. He told himself it was nothing, just another face, just another fleeting distraction. But deep down he knew he was lying to himself. His pride, however, refused to admit it, and so when their paths inevitably crossed near the gilded staircase at the far end of the ballroom, he leaned on the one weapon he had always trusted: arrogance. His lips curved into a smug half-smile as he looked her over, his blue eyes deliberately cold, and he let the words fall from his tongue like poison. "You're not my type." Selina paused, the sparkle of the chandelier catching the gleam in her dark eyes. For a moment she simply studied him, head tilted ever so slightly, as though deciding whether to even dignify his arrogance with a response. Then her lips curved into a slow, deliberate smirk, and she replied, with a calm sharpness that sliced through the air, "Good, because you're definitely not mine." Her words carried no hesitation, no nervousness, no trembling, only conviction. The dismissal hit him harder than he expected, striking straight at the core of his ego, and for the first time in years, Brethwood found himself standing there, speechless. Around them, a few onlookers blinked in surprise, their eyes flickering between the millionaire known for his cutting remarks and the woman who had just handed him his pride back in pieces. Brethwood forced a laugh, low and strained, trying to mask the sting of her words. But inside, something twisted. He was a man accustomed to women clinging to his every word, chasing his attention, basking in the rare moments he gave them. But this woman, this Selina Harris, she dismissed him with ease, as though his wealth and power meant absolutely nothing. That alone should have infuriated him, should have made him brush her off and forget her entirely. But instead he found himself replaying the way her lips had shaped those words, the spark in her eyes when she met his gaze without flinching. She walked away without another glance, leaving him rooted to the marble floor, his pride reeling and his chest burning with something dangerously close to curiosity. Later that night, in the glass-walled solitude of his penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Brethwood tried to force her out of his mind. He loosened his tie, poured another glass of scotch, and stretched out on the sleek leather couch as the city lights glittered beneath him. He told himself she was irrelevant, a momentary nuisance, nothing more. But as he closed his eyes, her image returned with merciless clarity, the curve of her red lips, the fire in her gaze, the fearless tone of her voice when she dared to dismiss him. He tossed back the scotch, muttering under his breath, "She's nothing. She means nothing." Yet the words rang hollow even to his own ears. He turned, shifted, tried to bury himself in the comfort of silence, but her smirk followed him like a shadow. By midnight, Brethwood had abandoned sleep entirely, pacing his penthouse like a caged animal. He stood before the towering glass windows, hands shoved into his pockets, staring at the city lights that stretched endlessly below. His mind battled itself, pride demanding he forget her, something deeper pulling him toward the memory of her voice. He clenched his jaw, furious at his own weakness. He had built an empire by controlling every thought, every decision, every desire. Yet here he was, unraveling over a woman who had barely spared him more than a few sentences. He tried to convince himself it was only because she had defied him, only because she had bruised his ego. But in the stillness of the night, Brethwood knew the truth he could not admit aloud. It wasn't just her defiance, it was her. Selina, meanwhile, returned to her apartment that night with a quiet smile playing at her lips. She had seen men like Brethwood before, men who thought their money, their power, and their arrogance made them untouchable. But she had also seen how quickly their facades cracked when faced with someone unwilling to bend to their will. She brushed out her braids, poured herself a glass of red wine, and sat by the window as the city hummed beneath her. Unlike Brethwood, she didn't waste time pretending. She knew he would think of her again. She could feel it in the way his smug expression had faltered when her words cut him. But whether his thoughts would bring her trouble or opportunity, only time would tell. Back in his penthouse, Brethwood leaned against the glass, staring at his reflection in the window. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him. His smirk was gone, replaced by something raw, unsettled, and dangerously human. He muttered her name into the empty room, Selina, testing the way it felt on his tongue, hating how much he liked it. He swore to himself that she meant nothing, that come morning she would fade from his thoughts like smoke. And yet, as the night stretched on and the city slowly quieted, he knew he was already lying. Brethwood finally forced himself to sit, dragging a hand down his face, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He swore he'd forget her, swore she would not matter. But when he closed his eyes, she was there again. Her smirk, her fire, her fearless words echoing like a taunt in his mind. He shot up from the couch, restless, unsettled, his pulse racing as though she were standing in the room with him. "Damn it," he whispered to the silence. "Why can't I stop thinking about you?" And as the city lights flickered below, Brethwood Cole, the cold millionaire who prided himself on never losing control, was forced to face a truth he wasn't ready for. Selina Harris had already begun to unravel him. The sleepless night in his penthouse left Brethwood restless, his mind filled with fragments of Selina's smirk, her words replaying like a melody he couldn't silence. By the time dawn broke and the city roared back to life beneath his skyscraper windows, he had convinced himself that work would steady him, that burying himself in deals and numbers would drown her from his thoughts. Yet, as he arrived at his towering office later that morning, stepping into the sleek glass and steel headquarters of Cole Enterprises, he carried the weight of her presence with him, an unshakable shadow trailing his every move. His staff, accustomed to his brisk commands and ice-cold demeanor, noticed the unusual sharpness in his voice, the impatience in his stride. He wasn't just a man running an empire that day. He was a man at war with himself, desperate to control something that was already slipping beyond his grasp. Fate, however, had a cruel sense of timing. Just when Brethwood thought he could bury the memory of her, the polished doors of his boardroom swung open, and the universe mocked him with brutal irony. Selina Harris stepped into his domain, not as a guest at a gala, not as a passing distraction, but as a professional, the new top consultant hired to salvage one of his most important deals. Dressed in a sleek navy suit that accentuated her poise and sophistication, she walked to the head of the long mahogany table, with her files neatly tucked under her arm, her expression calm, confident, utterly unshaken by the icy gaze that immediately locked onto her. The room, filled with executives and advisors, shifted with unease, sensing the storm brewing between them, though none of them dared to speak it aloud. Brethwood's arrogance flared instantly, his pride lashing out to mask the jolt of something else entirely that tightened in his chest at the sight of her. His lips curled into a smirk as he leaned back in his leather chair, voice dripping with disdain as he addressed her in front of everyone. "So, this is the miracle worker they brought in? Tell me, Miss Harris, how many doors have you batted your lashes at to climb into this room?" The words were sharp, cruel, designed to remind her, and everyone else, who controlled the space they stood in. A few executives shifted awkwardly, some even exchanging nervous glances, but Selina didn't flinch. Instead, she set her files down on the table, her movements steady, her posture regal. She met his gaze head-on, her voice calm yet sharp enough to slice through his arrogance. "Unlike you, Mr. Cole," she said, her words precise and deliberate, "I don't need arrogance to prove my worth." The silence that followed was palpable. A few of his executives widened their eyes, others held their breath, waiting for the explosion they were certain would follow. Brethwood himself froze, the expected surge of anger burning hot in his veins. But alongside it came something else, something far more dangerous. His pulse raced, his gaze lingered on the glow of her skin under the fluorescent lights, the elegance of her stance, the confidence radiating from her like a flame he couldn't ignore. He clenched his jaw, forced himself to look down at the documents before him. But it was useless. Every time she spoke, her voice struck him like a chord he couldn't unhear. Every time her eyes met his carefully constructed mask threatened to crumble. The rest of the meeting blurred, his mind unable to focus on numbers or projections when she was sitting across from him, commanding the attention of every person in the room with nothing more than her intelligence and presence. By the end of it, when the executives filed out, murmuring about strategies and deadlines, Brethwood found himself still seated, his fists tightening against the armrests, his pride refusing to admit the truth, his body screamed with every beat of his racing heart. He was drawn to her. That night, back in his penthouse, the city lights stretched endlessly before him once again. The glass walls framed the skyline like a glittering prison, each light below reminding him of the empire he had built, the empire that should have been enough. But as he stood there with his tie loosened and his drink untouched, only one image filled his mind. Selina Harris, standing in his boardroom, defying him with grace and fire, her voice echoing with truth he could not deny. He muttered her name into the quiet room. Selina, hating the way it tasted both like a confession and a surrender. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, unsettled, no longer the cold, untouchable man he had been just days ago. He tried to argue with himself, tried to insist this was nothing but unwanted attraction, an infatuation born from her refusal to bow to him. But as the hours dragged on and the city's hum softened into the stillness of night, Brethwood could no longer lie to himself. The one woman he had claimed he would never want had become the only one he could not stop thinking about. His arrogance, his pride, his wealth, none of it shielded him from the truth burning inside. And though he swore he'd never let her know, he already feared that this was not something he could control. As midnight bled into the early hours of morning, Brethwood slammed his glass onto the counter, his frustration boiling over. He had faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, and ruthless rivals without flinching. But the thought of one woman was unraveling him, piece by piece. He turned toward the dark expanse of the city and whispered her name once more, his voice low, almost a plea. Selina. And as the skyline blinked back at him, he knew with a chilling certainty that fate had no intention of letting him escape her. The real battle had only just begun. Brethwood leaned back in his leather chair after the long meeting, the silence of the boardroom echoing around him like an accusation. He should have felt victorious. After all, his strategies always won, his arguments always silenced opposition. But tonight felt different. Selina's voice lingered in his mind, not just her words, but the steel beneath them, the fire hidden in her calm tone that dared him to challenge her again. Every sentence she had spoken replayed in his head with a clarity he wished he could dismiss. And with every replay, he felt his chest tighten in ways that had nothing to do with anger. Her presence unsettled him. Her defiance threatened the icy control he had spent years perfecting. And yet he couldn't deny the strange, exhilarating energy that came alive whenever she looked at him with those fearless eyes. The next morning, the cycle repeated itself. She walked into the boardroom with her head high, a file tucked under her arm, her dark, smooth skin glowing under the fluorescent lights, her confidence radiating as though she belonged there more than anyone else. Brethwood found himself watching her far too closely, his gaze lingering on the curve of her lips when she spoke, on the graceful flick of her wrist as she emphasized her points. He told himself it was annoyance, that he was cataloging every movement as ammunition for the inevitable confrontation, but the truth simmering beneath was far more dangerous. She captivated him in ways he couldn't explain, in ways that irritated him even more because the last thing he wanted was to be captivated by anyone, least of all her. Their exchanges became the pulse of the meetings. Every time she challenged him, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion. And every time, Brethwood's responses grew sharper, colder, but beneath the surface an entirely different storm brewed. Her words were daggers, but they thrilled him. Her composure enraged him, but it also drew him closer, as though every wall she raised only tempted him to break through. More than once he caught himself staring, his jaw clenched, wondering how she managed to ignite a fire in him with nothing more than a steady look. That evening, after another heated presentation that ended with the board divided and tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, Selina was the first to rise. She gathered her notes with deliberate calm, her eyes brushing past Brethwood as if dismissing him. It infuriated him, the audacity of it, the refusal to acknowledge his power. And yet, before he knew what he was doing, he was standing as well, his steps echoing after hers. She entered the elevator, pressing the button with a casual flick, and he slipped in behind her just as the doors slid closed. For a moment, the air between them was unbearable. He could smell her perfume, subtle yet intoxicating, a mix of warmth and spice that clung to him and made his chest tighten. "You drive me insane, Selina," he muttered, the words slipping out before his pride could stop them. His voice was softer than usual, almost strained, as though the admission cost him something. Selina turned, her brows arched in quiet amusement, and in that tiny enclosed space, her presence felt overwhelming. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, her lips curving into a knowing smirk as she shifted her weight, her hand brushing against his arm, light, fleeting, yet powerful enough to send electricity coursing through his veins. Brethwood froze, the air around him suddenly sharp, and in that second all he wanted was to pull her against him, to close the distance and silence the maddening storm she stirred inside him. But she stepped away. Her eyes glinted with something unreadable, half challenge, half playfulness, and she said nothing as the elevator doors opened. Walking out with her usual grace, she tossed him a look over her shoulder, the kind that burned into him long after she disappeared down the hall. Brethwood remained inside, his pulse racing, his fists clenched at his sides, caught between frustration and desire. For the first time in years, he felt his armor cracking, a hairline fracture that widened each time she defied him, each time she smiled at him as though she knew exactly how dangerous she was to him. Later that night, Brethwood stood by the massive glass windows of his penthouse. The city stretched out before him in glittering lights, but the only image in his mind was her. He pressed his hand to the glass as though steadying himself, muttering her name under his breath, the sound of it making him curse quietly. She wasn't supposed to matter. She wasn't supposed to exist beyond the confines of their professional war. And yet, she had carved her way into his thoughts, into his blood, until even the silence of his luxury home felt haunted by her presence. He poured himself a glass of scotch, downing it in one sharp swallow, but the burn in his throat was nothing compared to the burn inside his chest. He feared her, not because of what she said in the boardroom, but because of what she was doing to him. Because if he wasn't careful, Selina might shatter the cold empire he had built around his heart. And yet, as much as he told himself he hated her influence, the truth was undeniable. He wanted more. The thought terrified him, thrilled him, consumed him. And as he stood there alone, he realized with a pang of dread that the cracks in his ice weren't closing. They were spreading, widening, and if she pressed just a little harder, he would break, and he didn't know if he wanted to stop her. Under the glittering chandeliers of the grand charity gala, Brethwood entered with his usual commanding presence, his tailored black suit sharp as steel, and his demeanor cold enough to send silent ripples through the room. Guests whispered his name in awe and caution, but for the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't occupied with power plays or business acquisitions. It was consumed by one face, one woman who had taken root in his thoughts like an unshakable storm. He scanned the hall with restless eyes, his arrogance masked with practiced indifference, until the very moment she appeared. Selina entered the ballroom draped in a crimson gown that shimmered like liquid fire under the chandeliers, the silk fabric hugging her curves with a grace that made time itself falter. The subtle slit of the gown revealed long, elegant legs, and her neckline sparkled with a single diamond pendant that lay gently against her smooth brown skin, catching every flicker of light. Conversations hushed, jaws tightened, and every pair of eyes in the room seemed to orbit her. But for Brethwood, the rest of the world dissolved the instant she walked in. His chest constricted as if he'd forgotten how to breathe, a strange heat spreading through him, not the usual desire that came easily with his reputation, but a burning that rattled the steel cage he had built around his heart. Selina's poise was deliberate, her chin lifted with quiet confidence as though she knew the exact effect she had on the room, yet she refused to give anyone, including Brethwood, the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She laughed lightly with donors, charmed senators with her wit, and commanded the space without raising her voice. Brethwood watched from across the floor, clutching his glass of scotch tighter, the amber liquid trembling slightly under his grip. His jaw clenched when he saw an eager young executive lean in too close, his hand brushing Selina's arm as he whispered something. Brethwood's gaze turned sharp, his possessiveness uninvited yet unavoidable. He downed his drink in one swift motion, the burn in his throat, no match for the fire raging in his chest. He told himself he wouldn't go to her. He couldn't. She wasn't his, she had made that painfully clear. But the sight of her radiant smile, the tilt of her head, the faint scent of her perfume, even from a distance, it pulled him forward like gravity itself. He moved through the crowd with deliberate steps, his broad shoulders parting the sea of tuxedos and gowns as though the universe itself made way for his arrival. His eyes never left her, his heartbeat pounding louder with every second. Selina noticed him before he reached her. How could she not? Brethwood's presence was impossible to ignore. Her lips curved ever so slightly, not a smile but something sharper, a knowing expression that told him she had already anticipated this moment. Before he could speak, she excused herself from the group, her crimson dress trailing behind her like flames licking the marble floor, and slipped through the balcony doors into the cool night air. Brethwood followed without hesitation, the need to be near her overpowering the whispers of decorum and restraint. The balcony overlooked the glittering city skyline, the moonlight bathing Selina in silver as the evening breeze teased strands of her stylish hair across her face. She didn't turn when she heard his footsteps. She simply rested her hands on the railing, her shoulders straight, her poise unbroken, though her pulse quickened beneath her calm facade. Brethwood stopped a step behind her, fighting the urge to close the distance, to claim the warmth radiating from her body. His voice came low, raw, stripped of the arrogance he usually wielded like armor. "Tell me you don't feel this," he murmured, his words rough like gravel, laced with a desperation he couldn't suppress. Selina stiffened slightly, her hands tightening against the railing. Her heart thudded violently against her chest, because she did feel it. The unbearable pull between them, the invisible thread that seemed to tighten every time he was near. But admitting it would mean surrendering control, and Selena had promised herself she would never become just another conquest for a man like him. She opened her mouth to reply, to deliver the sharp retort forming on her tongue, but Brethwood didn't wait. He stepped forward, his hand brushing against hers on the railing, and before reason could catch up to his hunger, he turned her toward him and captured her lips in a kiss that was fierce, hungry, and utterly forbidden. The world tilted as sparks ignited between them, her breath stolen as his mouth moved against hers with a passion that felt both reckless and inevitable. Selena's mind screamed at her to push him away, to resist the very thing she had sworn she wouldn't fall into, but her body betrayed her, responding to the heat of his touch, the intoxicating urgency of his kiss. His hand cupped her jaw with a tenderness that contrasted the wild intensity of his lips, and for a fleeting moment she allowed herself to drown in him, in the fire that neither of them could deny. Then, with a sudden force of will, Selena tore herself away, gasping for air as her chest heaved. Her lips were swollen, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something more dangerous, desire. Brethwood stood there, stunned, his breath ragged, his usually composed features undone by raw longing. "I'm not some conquest you can win, Brethwood," she whispered, her voice trembling yet unyielding, drawing a line in the sand even as her body still burned from his touch. He reached for her again, his hand almost grazing her arm, but she stepped back sharply, her crimson gown flowing like a curtain between them. The distance cut deeper than he expected, leaving him raw, aching, and restless. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that she wasn't just another fleeting temptation, but the words tangled in his throat, trapped by the storm of emotions he could barely understand himself. Selena's gaze locked on his, her eyes shimmering under the moonlight, carrying secrets and unspoken battles. "Don't mistake desire for love," she said, her tone soft yet heavy with warning, and with that she turned and disappeared back into the glittering ballroom, leaving him alone on the balcony, his chest hollow and burning. Brethwood remained there, staring into the night, his hands gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was losing control, or if he had already lost it the moment Selena entered his world. As the city lights stretched endlessly before him, he whispered her name under his breath, the sound equal parts curse and prayer. Inside the ballroom, Selena forced a smile as she rejoined the crowd, her lips still tingling, her heart pounding, her mind torn between fury and a dangerous yearning she wished she didn't carry. And as both of them tried and failed to bury the fire that had been set ablaze, fate was already weaving the next collision, one that neither of them would be able to walk away from. The night after the gala left Brethwood restless, lying awake in his penthouse with the taste of Selena's lips haunting him like a curse and a blessing all at once. He replayed that balcony moment over and over, her breathless defiance, her trembling words, and the fire in her eyes that told him she wasn't a woman who would surrender easily. He had kissed countless women before, yet none of them had ever left him sleepless. None of them had ever made him feel like his entire chest was splitting open just to make room for a single person's presence. He had walked away that night outwardly calm, but inside he had already begun to unravel, and for the first time Brethwood knew he was in trouble. The next morning, Selena tried to pretend nothing had happened, arriving at the office in a perfectly tailored cream dress that shimmered under the soft light of the lobby. She walked with her usual poise, her head high, her stilettos clicking against the polished marble, as though she owned the entire building. Yet Brethwood noticed every flicker of hesitation in her gaze whenever their eyes met across the boardroom table. She argued fiercely during the meeting, her voice sharp, but he could hear the quickened breath beneath her words. He wanted to call her out, to whisper that she felt it too, but instead he clenched his jaw and let her leave with her armor intact, even as his own was crumbling. That evening, he couldn't resist anymore. Brethwood sent a bouquet of roses to her office. Not just a handful, but dozens, each stem selected with precision, the petals a rich crimson that reminded him of her gown. When she entered her office, the fragrance filled the air so heavily that even her assistant gasped. Selina stood frozen, staring at the flood of flowers spilling across her desk, her window sill, even the corner table where she usually placed her coffee. She should have been annoyed. She should have rolled her eyes at such a grand gesture, but instead her fingers brushed against one velvet petal, and she felt her pulse skip. She didn't need to check the note tucked between them to know who it was from. But Brethwood wasn't done. The following morning, Selina arrived at her favorite cafe, hoping for a moment of solitude before work. She ordered her usual cappuccino, letting the warmth of the cup ease her tension, only to find Brethwood already there, seated at the corner table by the window. He wasn't reading the paper or tapping on his phone like he normally would. He was simply watching the door, waiting for her. When their eyes met, his lips curved into the faintest, unguarded smile, one that stripped away every ounce of his arrogance. She wanted to turn around, to walk away before she fell deeper into whatever madness he was weaving, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her to his table as though pulled by an invisible thread. "You shouldn't be here," she muttered, her voice tight, but he only leaned forward, his eyes soft. "And yet here I am. I can't seem to stay away, Selina." His words were low, unpolished, almost broken, and it startled her. She had only known him as the cold, calculating tycoon whose empire bent at his command. This version of him, waiting in cafes, watching her with longing instead of authority, unsettled her more than his arrogance ever had. She shook her head, trying to shield herself from the ache in his gaze, but even as she left him there, she could feel his eyes following her, long after the door closed behind her. The turning point came on a rainy evening when Selina returned to her apartment, her umbrella dripping, her heels clicking softly against the wet pavement. As she neared her building, her steps faltered. There, standing in the rain with no coat, no umbrella, was Brethwood. His hair clung to his forehead, his expensive suit soaked, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as though holding himself together. For once he wasn't composed, wasn't polished. He looked raw, undone, and when she reached him, he lifted his face to hers with an expression that pierced her heart. "Just one dinner, Selina," he whispered hoarsely, his voice nearly drowned by the rain. "Please." She should have told him no. She should have walked past, left him there to freeze in his obsession. But something about the way he said please, stripped of command, stripped of pride, as though he had torn down his empire and placed it at her feet, made her hesitate. Her chest tightened as she stared at him, droplets sliding down his jaw, his eyes so naked with yearning it made her shiver more than the rain. Against her better judgment, she sighed softly and murmured, "Fine." One dinner. Brethwood's relief was almost palpable. His lips parted in disbelief, his shoulders sagging as though she had just saved him from drowning. He followed her inside, water dripping from him as though he had stepped out of a storm, not just of weather, but of his own heart. That evening, seated across from her at a quiet, dimly lit restaurant, Brethwood was not the man she expected. He didn't boast about his wealth, didn't dominate the conversation with tales of his success. Instead, he asked questions, genuine ones, about her childhood, her dreams, the music she liked to listen to when she was alone. He laughed at her sarcasm, not with arrogance but with delight, and when she teased him, he smiled like a man starved of such simple joys. The wine loosened their walls, and for the first time Selina saw him without his armor. His laugh was deep and unguarded, his stories of failure, of moments when he doubted himself, revealed a vulnerability she never thought he possessed. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers, tentative yet desperate, like a man reaching for warmth after years in the cold. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers trembled in his grip, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice when he whispered, "I don't deserve you, but I'll spend every day proving I can." Her heart stuttered. She wanted to believe it, wanted to surrender to the hope in his words. Yet a voice deep inside warned her not to trust too easily. She pulled her hand back gently, her eyes searching his, trying to gauge whether this was just another performance or something real. The vulnerability in his gaze, however, was undeniable. It scared her more than any of his ruthless boardroom tactics ever had. Because if he was truly changing, if he truly meant it, then she risked losing not just her defenses but her heart entirely. When the dinner ended, he insisted on walking her home, his steps slow beside hers as though savoring every moment. The rain had cleared, the streets glistening under lamplight, and with each step she could feel his hand brushing dangerously close to hers, testing fate, aching to close the gap. At her door, she hesitated, turning to face him. His eyes were on her lips, his breath uneven, his entire body coiled with restraint. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, and she almost leaned in, almost gave him what both of them burned for. But then she stepped back, her voice a whisper edged with warning. "Don't think one dinner changes everything, Brethwood." His jaw clenched, but his eyes softened. "I know, but it's a start." And as she slipped inside, closing the door between them, Selina leaned against it, her hand pressed to her chest, her breath ragged. She knew she should stay away. She knew letting him in would be dangerous. But as she closed her eyes, the image of him standing in the rain, whispering please, refused to leave her mind. And she realized with dread that the cracks in her own armor were beginning to form. Yet neither of them knew that this fragile beginning was only the surface of something far more consuming, something that would blur the line between desire and destruction. The night after Brethwood whispered his broken yet sincere promise to Selina, the city seemed strangely alive, as though it too felt the pulse of something unstoppable between them. Selina lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, still hearing his voice echoing in her ears. "I don't deserve you, but I'll spend every day proving I can." That confession had been raw, unpolished, and unlike any word she had ever heard from the billionaire's lips. She hated herself for replaying it, but her heart refused to quiet down. The next morning, when she walked into her office, a hush fell over her team. She didn't have to look to know why. Brethwood was there, waiting, a faint smirk playing at his lips, but behind it, those same stormy eyes that had begun to change. He was no longer the untouchable man perched on a pedestal of arrogance. He was a man chasing her shadow, and his presence set her pulse racing, even as she told herself to resist. Their romance, once accidental, had become a flame too wild to contain. What began as stolen moments had turned into a hunger neither of them could deny. It started subtly, with stolen glances in crowded rooms, the kind that lasted a beat too long, speaking volumes neither dared say aloud. Then came the touches, his hand brushing against hers when no one was looking, the heat sparking like fire through her veins. One evening, when the elevator doors slid shut with only the two of them inside, Brethwood's restraint snapped. He pinned her gently against the mirrored wall, his lips capturing hers in a kiss so urgent, so desperate, that Selina forgot to breathe. She tried to whisper his name in protest, but it dissolved into a moan as he deepened the kiss, worshipping her with a reverence that melted the icy edges of her soul. By the time the doors opened again, both were flushed, their clothes straightened hastily, their hearts racing from more than just the stolen intimacy. It was dangerous, exhilarating, and utterly addictive. Neither could walk away anymore. Soon, nights in his penthouse became their sanctuary. The moment the city lights glowed, she would find herself wrapped in his arms, her laughter echoing through rooms that once knew only silence. Brethwood, once feared for his ruthlessness, transformed into a man who touched her as though she were a fragile treasure, precious beyond measure. He would trail kisses down her shoulders, whispering her name like a prayer, holding her close as though the world beyond those walls no longer existed. And Selina, despite every wall she had built, found herself surrendering. In his arms, she was not just a woman desired, but a woman cherished, seen, worshipped. Their nights stretched long, filled with fire and tenderness, until neither could remember a time when they had lived without each other. But the world noticed. It always did. It began with whispers, an assistant mentioning Brethwood's sudden softness, a rival remarking on how the once cold man now seemed distracted. Then came the photographs. A paparazzo captured them sharing a secret smile at a cafe. Another snapped a stolen kiss as she entered his car. Within days, headlines blazed across tabloids. The black woman who tamed the cold millionaire. The world turned its gaze sharply upon them, dissecting every move, every glance. Selina, who had fought her entire life to be seen as more than her beauty and her skin, now found herself judged in the harshest spotlight. Gold digger, some whispered. Temporary fling, others mocked. She tried to brush it off, but it stung, cutting deep into her pride. Brethwood, for the first time, felt the weight of society's gaze not for his wealth, but for his choice of love. His business rivals seized the moment. At board meetings, subtle digs turned into open attacks. "Your personal life is becoming a liability," one board member sneered, sliding tabloids across the table for all to see. "Investors are nervous. The company's reputation is at stake." Another leaned back in his chair, smirking. "End it before you burn everything down." Brethwood's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists beneath the polished mahogany table. They spoke as though Selina were nothing more than a stain to be erased, an inconvenience to be discarded. His heart roared with rage, but he stayed silent, his stormy eyes betraying the battle within. That night, when Selina looked at him with worry clouding her eyes, he tried to hide it, but she saw through him. "They'll never accept me," she whispered, pulling away from his embrace. "Maybe this is too dangerous." His grip tightened on her wrist, his voice low, fierce, trembling with desperation. "No, don't you dare walk away from me." But the pressure mounted. Friends he had known since his youth began to whisper behind his back, questioning his sanity. Old partners shook their heads, some even laughing openly at the idea that the ruthless Brethwood had been brought to his knees by love. Each word cut deeper than he expected. Yet instead of weakening, his obsession only grew stronger. The more the world pushed, the more he clung to her. One evening, standing before the towering glass windows of his penthouse, he looked at Selina and whispered, "If I lose everything but keep you, I've already won." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he cupped her face, sealing his vow with a kiss so deep, so consuming, that Selina felt her entire soul quake. The next day, Brethwood stunned the board. Standing tall in the conference room with cameras recording, he looked every man and woman in the eye. "You want me to end it for the company's reputation," he said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "Then you misunderstand who I am. I built this empire with my bare hands, but I'll burn it to the ground before I let any of you dictate who I love." Gasps rippled through the room, and murmurs erupted as his declaration struck like lightning. "If I lose everything but keep Selina, I've already won." His words echoed, immortalized by every reporter present. It was bold, it was reckless, it was unforgettable. But boldness always comes at a cost. Because while Selina's heart soared at his defiance, the shadows lurking in the corners of power began to stir. Rivals sharpened their knives, investors withdrew silently, and enemies who had once feared him now smelled blood in the water. And for the first time in years, Brethwood was vulnerable, not because of weakness, but because of love. Selina watched him from across the room that night, her chest tightening with a mix of pride and terror. For the first time, she realized their love wasn't just a romance. It was a battlefield, and the war had only just begun. And as Brethwood wrapped his arms around her, whispering, "No matter what they do, I won't let you go," Selina knew that the greatest fight of their lives had only started. But neither of them saw the storm that was already rising, ready to test if love could truly survive against pride. The echo of Brethwood's declaration, "If I lose everything but keep Selina, I've already won," still lingered in the air of the boardroom, shaking every corner of his empire. His words were reckless to men who counted profits instead of feelings, and as the murmurs turned into outrage, Selina felt her chest tighten. The price of his defiance was a target painted on her back, and the whispers that had haunted her since the first photograph now screamed in unison. She was destroying him. That night, while the city lights glimmered against the glass of his penthouse and his arms wrapped around her as if they were the only two people in existence, Selina's heart ached with a cruel truth. Loving him meant being the weapon others used to tear him down. She stayed awake long after he fell asleep, memorizing the slope of his jaw, the warmth of his breath against her shoulder, the softness he showed only to her. At dawn, with trembling hands, she left the letter by his bedside, her tears staining the ink that whispered a goodbye she was too weak to speak aloud. When Brethwood awoke to the silence, he reached for her, only to find an empty space where her warmth had been. His eyes fell on the folded paper, the curves of her handwriting stabbing at him before he even read the words. Each line was a dagger. "You deserve a world unbroken by scandal. You deserve a future untouched by my shadow. Loving you is my greatest gift. Leaving you is my only way to protect you." The letter slipped from his grasp, fluttering to the floor, and he pressed his hands against his face as the mighty skyscrapers outside blurred through his tears. For a man who once believed love was weakness, he now realized the true weakness was life without her. Meetings were missed, calls unanswered, deals collapsed like dominoes. But Brethwood didn't care. His empire could burn to ash, and still it wouldn't compare to the hollow silence of rooms where her laughter once echoed. He wandered the penthouse halls like a ghost, the scent of her perfume clinging to his shirts, her lipstick mark still haunting the rim of a forgotten wine glass. Days bled into nights, and nights bled into days, each one longer, crueler, emptier than the last. Sleep became a stranger, food a meaningless act, and mirrors showed him a man unrecognizable, creased suit, unshaven jaw, and eyes hollowed out by longing. He replayed every memory until it became torture. Her smile when he finally listened instead of bragged, her softness when she let him hold her hand across the table, her voice whispering his name as though it was more than just a word but a vow. He sat on the cold marble floor with her letter clutched in his fist, whispering to himself that if love was a battlefield, then he was already bleeding out without her. No empire, no board, no reputation could compare to the loss that gnawed at his bones. Yet, even in despair, pride chained him, until one night the weight of silence shattered him completely. Rain lashed against the city, tearing down the glass towers as if mocking his own fall. Brethwood stood outside her apartment, his expensive coat soaked through, hair clinging to his forehead, hands trembling around the bouquet of roses he had bought with the desperation of a man who had forgotten dignity. For hours he stood there, a king reduced to a beggar in the storm, waiting for her to come home, waiting for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. When her figure finally appeared in the glow of the streetlight, her umbrella tilted against the rain. Her steps froze as her eyes fell on him. The sight of him, once untouchable, now trembling like a boy lost, robbed her of breath. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, he dropped to his knees on the wet pavement, the bouquet crushed against his chest, his voice breaking into the night. "Selina," he whispered, every syllable raw. You are my air, my fire, my life. Please don't let me live without you." The rain blurred the world around them, but nothing could blur the sight of the proud millionaire kneeling, his suit wrinkled, his hands trembling, his eyes stripped bare of arrogance. For a heartbeat, Selina's walls nearly crumbled, but fear dug its claws into her. Fear of destroying him, fear of being the ruin history would write beside his name. She shook her head, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Breathwood, you don't understand. Loving me will cost you everything." But his grip on her hand only tightened, the roses dropping into the puddles at their feet. "Then let it cost me," he breathed, rain sliding down his cheeks like tears, "because everything without you means nothing." His words cracked the air like lightning, leaving her standing in the storm, her heart torn between love and pride, between running back into his arms and walking away forever. Selina stood frozen in the soft glow of her living room, still trembling from the weight of Brethwood's desperate confession on her doorstep. His knees had touched the cold floor, his voice breaking into shards that pierced her heart, and though she had let him in, her soul wrestled with doubt. Love had never been the problem. She loved him too much, but trust was fragile, and her fear was that a man raised on pride, power, and cold dismissals could never truly change. She needed proof that he wasn't just a billionaire bending out of loneliness, but a man transformed by love. When she looked into his weary, tear-streaked face that night, she whispered, "If you want me, you'll have to show me. Not in words, not in roses, but in the way you live." Those words hung in the air, soft yet demanding, and they became the test upon which their future balanced. Brethwood didn't argue, didn't beg further. He only took her hand, kissed the back of it with reverence, and promised through clenched emotion, "Then watch me." The days that followed were unlike anything the city had ever seen from him. For years, Brethwood had been the definition of arrogance. Boardrooms silenced by his cold stares, staff who feared a single mistake could cost them their careers, competitors who knew he never forgave weakness. But now Selina's challenge became his compass. On the very next morning, he walked into his company headquarters with a stillness that unsettled everyone. Employees exchanged nervous glances, bracing for another storm of his usual wrath. But instead of demanding reports in his cutting tone, he paused at the receptionist's desk, the same woman he had ignored for years, and simply asked, "How are you today, Margaret?" The woman nearly dropped her pen in shock. Whispers filled the air, confusion rippled through the office, and Selina's words whispered in his mind like a vow, "Prove it." That single moment was the first crack in the armor of his cold reputation. It didn't stop there. Brethwood began making appearances not at exclusive clubs or cutthroat meetings, but in neighborhoods where no one had expected to see him. With Selina by his side, he started funding community projects that mattered to her: libraries in struggling districts, scholarships for young women who looked like her and had once been told their dreams were impossible. Journalists first thought it was a publicity stunt, another CEO buying forgiveness with charity. But when they saw him walking hand in hand with Selina, smiling at children, listening to their stories with patience, the headlines shifted. "Cold millionaire melting for love," that's what they called it. And while the tabloids still mocked, his rivals grew restless, whispering that Brethwood was distracted, that love was softening the sharp edge that made him invincible. Yet, in every whisper of doubt, Selina saw proof that he was willing to lose the world for her. Nights were no longer about power either. Once, Brethwood had believed intimacy was a performance of control, but now each night became his quiet surrender. He would hold Selina close in his penthouse, the lights of the city fading behind glass walls, and he whispered her name as if it were both prayer and apology. His lips traced her skin not with hunger alone, but with gratitude, as though she was salvation made flesh. "Selina," he murmured against her neck, "you're not just my love. You're the only reason I know who I am anymore." Sometimes she resisted, still wounded, pulling back to ask, "And who are you now, Brethwood?" His answer was never grand, but always raw. "Yours." Each time, the sincerity in his tone chipped away at her fear, though her heart still lingered on the edge of doubt, forcing him to prove himself again and again. The transformation baffled his closest allies. Old friends from his elite circles no longer recognized him. At a dinner party, one of them scoffed, raising a glass of expensive wine. "Is this what Selena's turned you into? A man who trades mergers for soup kitchens?" Brethwood's jaw tightened, and once he would have snapped with a cutting insult. But instead, he simply replied, "No, she's turned me into someone worth loving." The silence that followed was louder than any boardroom argument. His rivals watched with suspicion, plotting ways to use his newfound softness against him. But Brethwood had stopped caring. Every decision now led back to one truth. Keeping Selena meant more than keeping his throne. Still, Selena tested him. One evening, as they stood overlooking the city skyline, she asked softly, "Would you still hold me if the world walked away from you?" He didn't hesitate. He drew her into his arms and whispered, "If the world walked away, I'd carry you with me through the ashes." His lips pressed to her forehead as though sealing a vow, but she didn't melt immediately. Instead, she gazed into his eyes, her voice trembling. "Then prove it tomorrow. Do something that costs you everything but gives us meaning." Her words were both a challenge and a lifeline. Brethwood stayed awake that entire night, staring at the ceiling, knowing the next step wasn't about gestures. It was about sacrifice. The next morning, he shocked the entire board of directors. He walked into the sleek conference room where whispers of his distracted leadership buzzed and laid a document on the table. A withdrawal from one of the most profitable yet morally questionable projects his company had ever pursued. Billions were at stake, power at stake, his reputation as an unflinching businessman at stake. But Brethwood simply said, "If the cost of this project is the soul of the people it hurts, then it's too expensive." The room erupted in chaos. Board members accused him of being blinded by love, of letting a woman rewrite his empire, of betraying everything he had built. But Brethwood didn't waver. His mind flashed back to Selena's eyes, the way she demanded more than words, and he answered the board with steady conviction. "Maybe I am blinded by love, but if that's the only way I've learned to finally see, then I welcome it." The board was stunned, some enraged, but Brethwood left that room with the weight of sacrifice heavy on his shoulders and the ghost of Selena's smile lighting his path. When Selena heard of his decision, her heart clenched. She hadn't expected him to go that far, to risk billions for the sake of aligning with the values she cherished. She pressed a trembling hand against her lips as tears blurred her vision, realizing this wasn't just performance, this was transformation. Yet she didn't let him see her melt entirely. When he came home that night, exhausted but glowing with defiance, she asked quietly, "Was it worth it?" He cupped her face, eyes burning with both pain and devotion. "If I lose everything but you, it will always be worth it." His words dug into her soul, unraveling her final defenses, though her heart still whispered one warning. Love this strong always invites danger. And danger was coming. In the shadows of his rival's schemes, a storm was brewing, and though Selena finally allowed herself to collapse into his embrace that night, whispering, "Maybe you really are mine," neither of them knew that the cost of love was about to test them in ways even Brethwood's redemption couldn't yet prepare for. The night after Brethwood had proven his redemption not just with words, but with changes that shook his entire empire, Selena felt something inside her loosen, as though the chains she had kept, locked around her heart, were finally starting to break. She saw him not only treating employees with genuine kindness, but also showing up at small community centers, schools, and hospitals, places she had once begged him to notice, only to be dismissed before. Now he was present, now he was listening, and now he was giving, not because it boosted his reputation, but because he knew it was a reflection of the woman he loved. That evening, when she returned home, she found candles flickering in the penthouse living room, soft jazz music playing, and Brethwood waiting in silence, his eyes filled with an emotion she had never dreamed she would see in him, humility mixed with hope. Selina's chest tightened because she remembered the man who had once arrogantly dismissed her as unworthy, who had sworn that his empire was his only bride. And yet here he stood, unrecognizable except for the sharp lines of his face that had always carried power. But tonight those lines were softened by love, and she couldn't help but let her heart ache in a way that warned her something unforgettable was about to happen. He reached for her hand without saying a word, kissed her palm as if it were sacred, and whispered, "I'm not asking for your forgiveness anymore, Selina. I'm asking for your forever." That promise alone sent shivers across her skin, but she tried to steady her heart, reminding herself that she needed more proof, until she saw the vulnerability in his trembling hands, and she realized that Brethwood was already proof enough. Later that night, he asked her to dress warmly, offering no explanation. Selina followed him reluctantly, curiosity gnawing at her, and soon she found herself stepping out of a private elevator onto the rooftop of his tallest skyscraper. The city stretched beneath them like a living canvas, the streets lit with golden veins, the skyscrapers glowing like guardians of the night. Above, the sky was scattered with stars, distant and endless, but none of them compared to the way Brethwood was looking at her. For the first time in her life, Selina felt the world pause. His hand squeezed hers tightly, almost as if he were afraid she might vanish in the cool night breeze. And then he slowly lowered himself to one knee. Her breath caught as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. His usual commanding presence was nowhere to be found. His shoulders shook, his jaw tightened, and his proud eyes filled with moisture. In a voice thick with emotion, he said, "Selina, you turned a cold, arrogant man into someone who finally understands love. You are my queen, my salvation, my forever. Will you marry me?" The words struck her like a wave, powerful and undeniable, and tears immediately filled her eyes. She had dreamed of this moment, feared it, even prayed for it. But to hear it spoken aloud by the very man who once swore he would never love her felt like stepping into a miracle. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to breathe through the storm of emotions surging inside her. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking, and it was all the answer Brethwood needed. He slid the ring onto her finger, and in that instant the city lights below seemed to glow brighter, as if the entire world was celebrating their union. He rose to his feet, cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her with a hunger that carried both desperation and devotion. Their lips clashed with urgency, sealing not only a promise but a destiny. The kiss was not about possession anymore. It was about surrender, about Brethwood finally bowing to the one force he could never conquer: love. Selina felt his tears mix with hers as their foreheads pressed together, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the empire, not the past, not the struggles they had endured. All that existed was the beating of their hearts in sync, and the realization that they had both fought their way to this moment. But as powerful as the proposal was, it was only the beginning of what that night held. Brethwood led her back into the penthouse, every step filled with reverence as though he were escorting royalty. And when they entered the candlelit bedroom, his hands trembled as he touched her, not from arrogance or entitlement, but from fear that he might never be worthy enough. Selina silenced his doubts with a gentle smile, pulling him closer, reminding him that love wasn't about worthiness. It was about choosing each other despite the flaws, despite the past, despite everything that could have kept them apart. That night, beneath the stars pouring through the wide glass windows, Brethwood made love to her with a devotion that proved his transformation was complete. His lips traced her skin as though memorizing every inch, whispering her name with reverence as though it were a prayer. The man who had once mocked love now worshipped at its altar, his every touch a vow, his every breath a promise. Selina gave herself to him without hesitation, and together they created a rhythm that bound them forever, a rhythm of passion, of forgiveness, of eternity. Hours later, when dawn broke and painted the horizon in shades of gold and pink, Selina lay in his arms, her head resting against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that once belonged to a man of stone, but now beat only for her. Brethwood stroked her hair and whispered, "You saved me, Selina. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I belong only to you." She closed her eyes, smiling through her tears, knowing that for the first time his words were not just declarations, but truths carved into his soul. The days that followed became a testament to their union. Brethwood no longer chased boardrooms and victories with the same hunger. Instead, he chased moments with Selina. He turned meetings into mornings spent by her side, traded power lunches for walks in the park, and replaced cold silences with soft laughter that echoed through their home. To the outside world, it seemed like the mighty Brethwood had lost his edge, but in truth, he had found something sharper, something indestructible: love. His rivals shook their heads, unable to believe that the man who once ruled with an iron fist was now seen holding hands in public, kissing Selina openly, whispering, "My queen," without shame. But Brethwood didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't living for appearances. He was living for love. The proposal on the rooftop had changed everything, but what sealed it was the life they built together afterward. Selina found herself not only cherished but also uplifted. Brethwood supported her dreams, encouraged her passions, and reminded her daily that she was not just loved, but celebrated. And every night, when the world quieted, he knelt again, not in weakness but in devotion, pressing kisses to her hands, her forehead, her lips, whispering vows that needed no ceremony because they were etched into the fabric of their existence. In the end, the man who once stood cold, arrogant, and untouchable became the very picture of love's redemption. Brethwood was no longer a millionaire defined by his empire. He was a man defined by the woman who had stolen his heart and rebuilt his soul. Their love became their empire, stronger than steel, brighter than the city lights, eternal as the stars. And as Selina gazed at the ring on her finger and the man who held her as if she were his entire universe, she knew one truth above all else. She had not only tamed a cold heart, but she had claimed it forever. And so the story of Brethwood and Selina closed not with an ending, but with a beginning. The kind of beginning where forever was not just a word, but a life they would live hand in hand, heart in heart, soul in soul, forever and always.